Today I want to build on Lev Manovich's augmented space paradigm by proposing 4 metaphors which describe the experience of immediate physical space in the context of urban screens. However, I want to extend Lev Manovich's work by proposing to narrow its focus on the interactive character of this experience. So the question I'm asking today is, what metaphors of spatial interaction could be used to describe the experience of urban screens in an architectural setting? The main assumption I'm making is that urban screens constitute a new ontological paradigm in which technology, the body, and space intersect and interact in unique ways. I'm using a phenomenological approach to look at urban screens, but I'm also drawing on the history of art and design. Specifically, my metaphors for spatial interaction are inspired by the imaginings of the surrealists. By exploring some of the ideas of one of the most fertile avant-garde art movements of the 20th century, this paper is going to attempt to chisel out an ontological framework that meshes architectural space and virtual space. I'm going to use the term hyperspace to describe each of the 4 metaphors of spatial interaction, because hyperspace is a term that Marcel Duchamp used to designate the 4th dimension of space. The 4 types of hyperspace I will be discussing are haptic space, convulsive space, reflexive space, and conceptual space. Let's first talk about haptic space as hyperspace. In 1942 in New York, Duchamp presented a famous installation intervention titled 16 Miles of String for the first Papers of Surrealism exhibition. He had been asked by Elsa Schiaparelli to create the exhibition design for this show. Duchamp laid out a mile of white string in a cat's cradle maze pattern across the drawing room of the palazzo-style Victorian mansion used as the main exhibition hall for this exhibition. The string was taut between gilded moldings, crystal chandeliers, and Italianate painted ceiling into a giant cobweb installation that stood as a barrier between exhibition goers and the 100-plus artworks on display. Those brave enough to undertake the exercise could worm and contort their way into and around a tangled, crisscrossed obstacle course of string to see the art up close. For many of those adventurous guests, as well as for the reluctant spectators who remained behind, the focus of the show became the exhibition space as a whole rather than the artworks themselves. It could be argued that this strategy activated the exhibition space and made it, in a rather unusual way, interactive. I found it most useful to consult his white box notes, which contain utopic inspirational musings on the subject of space. This is an excerpt from his correspondence that reveals his attempt to understand the 4th dimension of space. Open quotations. A tactile sensation which envelopes an object on all 4 sides approximates a tactile sensation of 4 dimensions. Naturally, none of our senses find such a quadridimensional capability, except maybe that of touch, and therefore the act of love as a tactile sublimation might enable one to visualize, or better tactualize, a physical interpretation of the 4th dimension. Close quotations. In this passage, Duchamp contemplates whether the cognitive haptic experience of the sense of touch could constitute a 4th dimension of space. In the same collection of writings that date back to the 1960s, he refers to this 4th dimension either as hyperspace or as virtuality. Thus, his concept of the 4th dimension is either haptic, that is hyperspace, or optical, the virtual image, although this description only refers to seeing in the sense of touch. In other sections of the white box notes, Duchamp extends these ideas to the sense of smell, of taste, and of hearing. Anne Hamilton's artwork Mattering offers an example of all 3 in the context of a non-digital installation. It was a project produced by the artist in 1997-98 with the aim of exploring haptically experienced perception. In this piece, Hamilton draped the entire surface of a colossal exhibition hall with a sheet of orange silk hung 5 feet below the ceiling. The electric mechanism on which it was attached slowly moved the swelling canopy laid across the room in a vertical up and down motion, bathing visitors below in a warm colored light filtered by the orange cloth. Underneath the undulating silk, 5 bright feathered male peacocks paraded around the room or else rested on wall-mounted perches. The presence of the peacocks and their colorful feathers, as well as the textures and color in the room, were instrumental in creating the design conditions of a haptic space. Because urban screens emit immersive light over public spaces of architectural scale, they too have the potential to create haptic space. Now let's talk about convulsive space as hyperspace. The surrealist preoccupation with identity has long been a subject of study in art history. André Breton once wrote in reference to surrealism, "Who knows if, in this way, we are on the point of breaking away from the principle of identity?" This quote is often eclipsed by his more famous words, "Beauty will be convulsive, or it will not be," which were transposed by Max Ernst as, "Identity will be convulsive, or will not exist." What is meant by these cryptic phrases? In Breton's writing, the word convulsive had various meanings. One of these was the state of uncertainty that results from the contrast of opposites. Rabaté reports, for instance, that in the first chapter of L'Amour Fou, published in the magazine Le Minotaure in 1934, Breton wrote, "Convulsive beauty will be erotic veiled, fixed explosive, magic circumstantial, or it will not be." Taken in this context, convulsiveness is a destabilizing, dialectical force that can provoke a state of heightened awareness. A possible application of convulsiveness from a design perspective could involve enabling a variated control of the degree of theatrical display, motion, or immersion in a new media installation in order to cause breaks and modulations in perception. 1 minute, the spectator's attention is focused on a digital projection. The next, it shifts onto what is happening in the immediate physical space. Provoking such changes could cause a sense of displacement or spatial disorientation, but it would likely also cause heightened aesthetic awareness, that is, a sense of convulsive beauty. Urban screens can be said to be convulsive spaces in that they are new media platforms of architectural scale that ontologically produce an experience oscillating between physical space and virtual space, between reality and theatricality, or between a sense of place, a location, and a space of signs, of representation. In their art, the surrealists challenged the idea of the self as a single identity. For instance, double or multiple representations of the self are recurring visual motifs. We see an example here with René Magritte's portrait of Paul Nouget. Adamovich claims that the surrealists used photography as a medium to explore the destabilization and splitting of identity, portrayed as a locus of contradiction, fragmentation, and decentering. In the large body of surrealist works, the self is split. It is displaced, it is dislocated, it is fugitive and changing. It hides behind masks, or it is erased by mise-en-scène and an artful use of technology. Man Ray's 4 portraits of André Breton offers an illustration of this point. In the left to right, top to bottom progression of quadrants, Breton is gradually erased from the image by the solarization process until he completely disappears behind aviator glasses and a cutout mask. Adamovich argues that such a photograph of Breton denies access to his identity. It is noteworthy that masks and dolls were often used as a stand-in for the displaced self in surrealist art in the interbellum. Man Ray's Noir et Blanche and Hans Bellmer's La Poupée are a few examples of this. One could argue that surrealist art offers an earlier historical precedent of how technologies of representation can be used to create new forms of identity and manifestation of the self. It is in this sense that the surrealist concepts of convulsive beauty and convulsive identity could inform and inspire the design of urban screens. For their experimentation paved the way to the idea that the self can manifest in many forms of representation, to be displaced, disembodied, fragmented, and erased. Now let's talk about self-reflexive space as hyperspace. What happens when the viewing subject, multiplied through representation, is positioned at once inside and outside a scene? That is, when the viewed and the viewer are one and the same. Given that the strategy, one where duplicate selves are at once phenomenologically reunited within a single frame of representation, was yet another way for surrealists to give form to convulsive beauty, this question informs our third metaphor of spatial interaction for urban screens. The surrealists were fond of using the stratagem of mise-en-abyme in the art they produced. For instance, René Magritte's Waterfall is an example of one of the several works in which he depicted a visual mise-en-abyme. Simply stated, a mise-en-abyme can be described as a literary or visual device that consists in duplicating an aspect or detail of a representation within the representation at large. An image reflected in an endless hall of mirrors, a story within a story, a frame within a frame, or a self-referential work are various forms of mise-en-abyme. Seeing the self represented multiple times in an installation in which the viewer is physically present would constitute a form of mise-en-abyme, as it is a construction that reflexively duplicates an aspect of the subject, within their image, within a matrix of representation. This poses an ontological question. Would this setup have an effect on how the viewing subject defines the spatial boundaries of the self? If spectators were to see themselves in a large-scale installation, their point of view could shift to a more omniscient one. The word could is used with caution because when it comes to aesthetics, the efficacy of a design technique can only be measured through empirical testing. Although such an evaluation lies outside the scope of this theoretical essay, it is suggested that the strategy of mise-en-abyme applied to urban screens could, from a cognitive perspective, considerably alter the viewing experience by expanding the spatial boundaries of the self beyond the body, as well as contracting them into a self within a self. This brings us to our last metaphor of spatial interaction for urban screens, which is conceptual space as hyperspace. In keeping with their allegiance with psychoanalytic theory, quintessential to the surrealist project was the process by which the content of the unconscious was to be liberated, exposed, externalized, and given textual or visual form in the real world. The end game of this was to transform physical space into a space for imaginings and longings. To achieve this, the surrealists appropriated various concepts derived from psychoanalytical theory. One of these was the Freudian process of inversion. One could speak of an inversion between the phenomenal and the conceptual when representations that can be described as images of the mind, fantastical imaginings, or oniric mindscapes are projected and overlaid onto the real to break with the imitation of appearances. If such two-dimensional representations can be described as conceptual images of the mind, what happens when these are transposed to three-dimensional architectural spaces? I propose that this could result in conceptual spaces of the mind, layers of visual information projected with digital technology over a real physical space augments this space. It could also be argued that it remaps it into a new spatial scheme. Thus, a fourth type of hyperspace is created, one in which the fourth dimension is a conceptual mindscape through which viewers move. An installation by Robert Rauschenberg, an artist strongly influenced by the surrealist movement, helps illuminate this discussion. Because it is set in an enclosed room that has been saturated with representations, it could be argued that the conceptual tends to dominate over the phenomenal in Rauschenberg's Eros installation showing his bed painting. Eros is replete with artworks that represent imaginings inspired by the surrealist movement. At the far end of the room, center left of the image, Rauschenberg's bed leans against the wall next to the African wood carving. The walls and ceilings leading up to this pièce de résistance are covered with framed paintings. Wall-mounted accent lights define the three-dimensionality of volumes by creating dramatic contrast between highlights and shadow. This installation is a theatrical space, a space of spectacle, a space of narratives. It's the great emphasis placed on representation and the poetics of this constructed space that warrants its designation as a conceptual space. So this brings us to our conclusion today. Drawing on surrealist strategies of representation, this theoretical essay has proposed 4 metaphors of spatial interaction that could support the design and implementation of urban screens in their architectural settings. It has done so by attempting to give the concept of hyperspace, that is, the non-Euclidean imagining of the fourth dimension of space, 4 different definitions. The result is a first paradigm of hyperspace inspired by Duchamp's concept of haptic space as the fourth dimension. The second is a paradigm of hyperspace that construes urban screens as a convulsive space that provokes a shift in attention and presence between the various components of augmented space. The third is a paradigm of hyperspace in which urban screens are experienced as a self-reflexive space. And the final and fourth paradigm of hyperspace hinges on the inversion of the phenomenal and conceptual processes in order to provoke the impression that viewers are moving inside a space of the mind, that is, a space saturated in representation. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention.